They work and live under some of the most difficult conditions. Where they live is where they work. For farm workers, life as they know it is under threat. Join us this week as we look at farm workers and their working conditions. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one?
Welcome to our weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Ashik Trivedi. Once again, thank you very much for having joined us. Now, during the past 30 years, millions of poor farm workers and farm dwellers and their families have been evicted. They, of course, have been evicted from their homes and their farms, while particularly done by white farm owners. This despite the government having introduced specific laws to protect farm dwellers from horrific practices. In fact, the evictions of farm workers increased after the extension of the Security of Land Tenure Act of 62 of 1997, which in fact had been passed. It is estimated that between 1994 and 2004, during the first particular decade of democracy alone, over 1 million farm workers and their families have been evicted from their homes and on the land which they had resided. This has continued unabated since then, and in the recent week, farm workers have stepped up their evictions of farm workers. And in today's show, we look at why this is happening and what is being done about it. But first, we go to our insert prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
We was evicted on Monday here by Plain Acker. They crushed our places with the bulldozers and everything, and with nowhere else to go. That's why everyone is here by the road, because no one has anywhere to go.
After staying for 19 years on the farm.
After staying 19 years on the farm. Our lawyers was in court on Monday, and they didn't even inform our lawyers that they are coming. They put our stuff in storages. Now we have the problem that we don't have clean clothes. The elderly need medication, and the medication is also in the storage.
Ja, die boer is goed, weet. Hy volg nou al daardie dinge van dat jy 60 jaar oud is en jy 10 jaar gewerk, verstaan dan dat jy mos 'n langtermyn verblyfsreg. Ja, weet maar al daai word gevolg op die plaas waar ek bly. Maar wat hulle ook nog maak, weet maar nou het hulle die ander strategie wat hulle uitdaag. En nou die omstandighede waarin ons as ou mense en afgetredes en disabilities bly, weet is baie kere baie onhagelijk. Weet, dit is ook 'n deel wat hulle op 'n mens uitoefen, weet, om vir jou, om so in verdrukking te bly, weet, en dat jy wil anders om aan uit te sien, om lieverstok maar daar in die dorp te loop bly, weet, om daar te loop plak, weet, om dan daar naby alles te kom, want al jou voorregte word weggevat, sien, op daardie plaas, die oomblik, verstaan, as jy nie meer 'n permanente werker is, jy weet, jy my oomblik jy nie meer kan werk vir die plaas, jy weet, dan het jy geen voordele nie.
Mense wat 80 jaar oud is op die plaas, 80 jaar, hulle hele lewe, hier spandeer het, hulle moet nou gaan. Ons gaan nee! Ons bly nee!
Daar's van die inwoners wat al van 1954 af al op die plaas bly, wat gebore is op die plaas. So baie mense het gewerk vir die eerste eienaar van die plaas. Hulle was werksaam op die plaas. En hulle het na die eerste eienaar die plaas verkoop het hulle vir die tweede eienaar het hulle gewerk. So baie van hulle werk nie meer vir hom nie as gevolg van ouderdom. Baie van hulle is, soos ek gesê het, 60 en ouer. Omdat hierdie nuwe eienaar maak meer gebruik van immigrante of hy maak gebruik van buitedorpe, soos byvoorbeeld Lutzwil en Vredendal, se mense om te werk op die plaas, het hy gesien, maar hy het hierdie huise, het hy nou nodig. Hy wil die huise gebruik vir sy werkers, maar ongelukkig beskerm die wetgewing baie van die huisgesinne. Die Nasionale Portfolio Komitee van Rural Development was op die plaas, om die plaas te kom besoek rakende die issues van welvaart en gemeenskap. En op daai stadium het die voorsitter van die Nasionale Portfolio Komitee gesê, maar die departement moet gaan kyk om 'n offer te maak aan die plaaseienaar om die plaas te koop, die hele plaas te koop, of dan ten minste 7 hektar. Die offer is toegemaak. Daar was 'n meeting gewees met die plaaseienaar. Ongelukkig het die eienaar gesê, maar hy is nie bereid om sy plaas te verkoop nie. Hy is ook nie bereid om ewen 7 hektar van die plase te koop nie. Tot op hede toe het ek persoonlik van SPP se kant af nog nie die skriftelike dokumentasie gekry waarin hy geweier het nie. Ons het dit nog net elke keer mondelings gehoor deur sy prokureurs wat hy aangestel het.
You know, farmers putting people out of their houses. Unfair dismissal, and then the eviction are following. That is why we're trying to stop the evictions and even the moratorium that we ask of the government to be signed, the eviction moratorium. They didn't do anything about that. You know what the farmers say? The farmers are so arrogant. They say that they are the government. You know? They say they are the government. They make the laws. So we can't do anything about that.
So in die hele Matsikama area is dit die trend waarin ons nou is, dat daar soveel uitsettings wat mense in die gesig staar, en ons probeer soveel as moontlik mense sê, bly in die huise. Op Karoo vlakte sit ons nou ook met mense wat uitsettings in die gesig staar, huise wat daar probeer afgebreek is, bo op hulle. So ons probeer soveel as moontlik bewusmaking doen in Matsikama, dat mense moet weet dat jy veilig nog solank wat jy in die huis is, maar as jy eers uitbeweeg, dit is waar die moeilikheid kom, waar ons jou nie kan help. Dit is 'n uitdaging vir ons in Matsikama, dit is 'n uitdaging vir ons in die hele Weskaap, Witzenberg, Bergrivier, Cederberg, en ons probeer vanaf die NGO soveel as moontlik mense bewus maak van hulle se regte, sodat hulle kan weet want om te gaan as hulle uitsetting in die gesig staar, om te weet dat uitsetting is onwettig as daar nie 'n hofdokument is nie, sodat mense kan weet, solank daar nie 'n hofbevel is nie, is hulle nog geregtig om te bly totdat die saak voor die hof kom.
There we've heard it, of course, a very difficult situation that clearly smacks of insecurity for those that quite don't know whether they're going to hold on to their jobs and, of course, where they're going to live. And that's the only place of recent memory that they know of some generations having been born on these very farms from which they're now being evicted from. But that's our conversation, understanding where these evictions are coming from and why they continue to happen at this rate and pace that they are, what the law says about it, and also what the socioeconomics that come certainly with this particular segment of the working class. With me, I have Tenure Jansen, a coordinator at the Maibue Women's Forum, also the Inyanda National Land Movement. We have Wendy Pakir, the founder of the Ubuntu Rural Women's Youth Movement, as well as Tando George, a candidate attorney at SERI, of course, being the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, joining us here in studio. Thank you very much for having joined us. I want to start off with you, Wendy, very quickly, to understand what is the nature of these evictions? Why? What are the main reasons for farm workers being evicted from their farms, or at least where they're living at the moment?
Yeah, there are many reasons. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. There are many reasons why farm workers are evicted. I mean, if we look at historically, and in the first 10 years of our democracy, 1 million people were evicted from farms. 77% were women and children, and only 1% of the evictions went through the court. That's separate from the displacements of the more than 2 million people displaced during the same period. I mean, in a 10-year period. That's what I'm referring to. And Nkuzi and Social Survey did a study around the evictions, and what they found was that most of the evictions occurred during the time when the minimum wage for farm workers, the sectoral determination, came into pass, and the second biggest time when there was mass evictions from farms, when the Extension of Security of Tenure Act, which we call ESTA, which is the Land that Protect Farm Workers' Tenure Rights, when that law was being passed. What's currently happening on farms, you know, your job on the farm is linked, it's linked to the house that you live on. That's now for farm workers that live on the farm. When the employment relationship ends, farm workers are evicted from the farm. When housing contracts are entered with men mainly because they are considered the breadwinners, women are seen as the extensions of male labor. That's why when the husband passes on, when the husband can no longer work, maybe there's ill health, or the husband gets dismissed from the farm, we often see that evictions also follows that. It means the entire family are now out on the streets. But I think something that we've been fighting for a very long time is that women are recognized in their own right. So even when the employment relationship ends with the male, the woman who is maybe a seasonal worker on the farm or might have some employment on the farm, she must be recognized for her right to live on the farm as well. And then there's the newest trend of farm worker children. When they turn 18, they are evicted from farms, or their parents must pay very high rental for them to stay on the farm. And 2 years ago, we've dealt with 3 dismissals from farms where the farmer put the onus on the workers to evict their elderly children.
Yeah.
Wendy,
you've shared quite a bit of with us, right? And I want to piece through some of them very, very quickly. But before I go there, Adenia, how widespread is this problem? Is it concentrated in certain areas, or is it a widespread practice across the farming community? All right, we'll come back to Dina very, very shortly. Dina, you with us?
Yes. So good morning, everyone.
Good morning. I was asking how widespread of a problem this is at the moment.
The problem is quite widespread. Because it's not in one municipality; it's in all the municipalities. Especially, I think Witzenberg and the Langeberg is the hotspots for the evictions. I'm working in the Langeberg municipality, and recently we see a rise into the farm evictions. And I know that Witzenberg also have this problem of the rising issue of evictions into the Witzenberg municipality. So it's widespread. I think, like Wendy was saying, is that many of these cases doesn't reach us as the union, Kasawa, or the Rural Legal Center, because people don't know where to go. They just accept that we've been evicted, so we going. Yeah.
And where do they ordinarily go when they get evicted? Are they left on the street?
They usually been dumped in the informal settlements. After the 2020, after the farm worker strike in 2012, we saw a lot of farm workers being dumped across the railway in Kobela and Robertson, and the others has been dumped of Opikopi and Robertson Boerdorp. So it's usually you dumped on in the informal settlement.
On the street and then in the informal settlement. Right. So I want to get a legal opinion after this. What is the obligation of farmer and farm worker under the law? That and more we'll pick up after the break. Do stay with us. Farm worker evictions, our conversation here today. We look at the complexity of this issue, contextualize it, and look at what the law states, what the obligation of the employer is in this particular regard. A panel of guests with me in studio, and some certainly online as well. I want to very quickly go to Tando Georgia, joins us here in studio, candidate attorney for Seri. What does the law state? Of course, there's the Extension of Security of Land Tenure Act of 62, which of course in 1997, that particular piece of legislation came into effect. what does it in effect say, and how does it respond to farm worker evictions?
So what ESTA, firstly, good morning, and thank you for having us on the show. So what ESTA seeks to do is to provide security of tenure for farm workers. I think, as you rightfully pointed out earlier, that farm workers have a unique type of work in that work and where you live is in the same place.
Yeah.
And so what ESTA seeks to do is to provide security of tenure for those people who work on the farms or who occupy the farmlands. Also, what ESTA seeks to do is to ensure that no one is evicted arbitrarily, no one is evicted illegally without a court order. And so it provides those protection. It provides protection for occupation, but also it provides protection so that if you are evicted, that the law has certain guidelines and provisions to ensure that you aren't left homeless in the event that the court grants that order.
And those provisions, is it that the farmer is obligation to provide alternative accommodation, or what would be the criteria under which an eviction can be effected?
So what ESTA does is it provides guidelines, like I just said. And so a farm owner has his rights. As the owner, he has those types of rights. As the occupier, you have your own set of rights.
Yeah.
So the court wants to strike a balance between the two parties. That if you want to evict someone, firstly, you must have a lawful ground. And then secondly, it then provides guidelines as to what the process is. So the process will require a notice, that you need to provide a notice to the farmer, the occupier. You then need to also mediate. So before we go to court and we litigate, we try to find a solution which provides a remedy for both parties, because court, obviously, the winner takes it all. Whereas if you mediate, you cut down that process and you seek to find a solution for both parties.
And what obligation does the farmer have to the widower of an employee that worked for him? So let's say the male was the farm worker, to which accommodation was provided, but now, as Wendy's example, that the husband passes on and the family then gets evicted, is the farmer, the owner of the land and the property, is he obligated to keep the rest of the family under his tenure on his land?
So when a person is employed, two relationships are formed. So firstly, it's your employment relationship. Secondly, it's your occupation. There is no link between the two. So when you stop working, that doesn't automatically nullify your right to occupy the property. ESTA recognizes families. So under ESTA, the family that you occupy your home with has the same right to occupy the land. So evicting a person because they are unemployed or because their spouse who was employed is deceased is not a lawful way to carry out that eviction under ESTA.
Wendy, under what sort of circumstance do those that do occupy those homes, are they paying rent, or is it offset by them being an employee of the business, of the farmer?
Yeah, on many farms, farm workers are expected to pay rent. The sectoral determination for farm workers regulate rental on farms. It would, for instance, say that you can't pay more than 10% of your salary towards rent. It's when people stay in a compound setting, for instance, lots of workers staying together, then it can't be more than 25%. But then the house should meet certain requirements, certain square meters, there should be water, running water, toilet, and these kind of things before deductions can be made for rental for your salary. There are farms, however, who does not charge people for rental. That's the more progressive farms, and sometimes you can see that people even live in more decent housing. So we have reported a lot of farmers to the Department of Labor before, where there was unlawful deductions, where rental were deducted and the house didn't meet the requirements. But I want to let's on to the previous question in terms of the spouses, say for instance, the husband no longer work. ESTA also speak of long-term occupier rights. When you're 60 years old, you worked on the farm for 10 years or you lived on the farm for 10 years. Say for instance, the husband worked on the farm, he's 60 years old, he's retired now, he's a long-term occupier. He can only be evicted under conditions where he violates rights on the farm. Say for instance, he's a danger to people, he damages property, or he's a danger to the farm. Then the employer may go to court and apply for an eviction notice. Say for instance, he passed on and his spouse is still there. She has never worked on the farm, but she lived on the farm for over 10 years. She's over 60 years old. She would be considered a long-term occupier. but that doesn't cover the children. If both the husband and the wife die, they were long-term occupiers. The children, the law says they've got 12 months to remain on the farm because they are protected through the right to family life within ESTA as long as their parents are on the farm and alive, but they should enjoy long-term occupier rights. We've dealt with 2 evictions last year where long-term occupiers were evicted. Now, one was moved from a 5-room house to a smaller house because her husband passed on. In the other case, the long-term occupier received a notice of motion coming from the land claims court in Randburg to say that she must appear in court. It's an eviction notice. She must go to Randburg. If she cannot go to Randburg, she must join via Zoom call or video conferencing. She doesn't own a smartphone. She doesn't even know about Zoom. She doesn't know about video conferencing. She was misled by the sheriff in the first place because the land claims court would have a sitting at the nearest court, which meant the eviction court case happened in an absence. The eviction was granted. She had 12 family members in her house. On the day of the eviction, she didn't get an execution notice to say, listen, your eviction will take place on this day. She didn't know the eviction was granted. On the day of the eviction, the sheriff came. They came with a court order, and then she had to leave the farm. You can only imagine the trauma. She left to a 1-room house in Durbanville. Her children and the grandchildren stayed behind because they go to school on the farm. They slept at the gates of the farm for 2 weeks. And then the farmer came, he took 1 truck of furniture to the house. The house couldn't house all the furniture, so the children stayed next to the road with the other furniture. The farmer came, he picked it up with a truck, and we suspected he dumped it. You asked Delia the question earlier, where do people go? Sometimes people don't know about our organization, so we must be more visible, I think. In a case like that woman should never be evicted. She didn't break any laws. She worked on the farm herself. She was a long-term occupier. The trauma she suffered, I witnessed her house being bulldozed, trying to stop it, bringing the police there. And they said, if I don't have a court order to stop the bulldozing, there's nothing we can do because it's private property. They can do as they like. The children moved back onto the farm into an empty house because they closed the locks of the house. The farmer came 2 months later and they bulldozed the house where they were in. And then we stopped the bulldozing because they were in the house 24 hours after the eviction. They were there for 2 weeks already. So he must go back to court to apply for a new eviction order. So the children and the grandchildren are still on the farm, being seen as illegal occupants. And we asked the Department of Rural Development to appoint an attorney. We actually asked them to take this matter, the damaging of a property, the dumping of a property, they must do a damage claim for that. The eviction was illegal, but there's no house he can return to. So we asked the department to do an intervention, and the same with the other auntie that were moved from a 5-room furniture in storage facilities outside, broken, and we said a damage claim must be done. So the sheriff must be taken on the boards of sheriffs for evicting people in the inhumane way that they do.
Yeah, I just want to understand very quickly, Wendy, before I go to a break, I just want to go to Tenure quickly and ask you, Tenure, whether at the moment the majority of the evictions are non-employees, as in it's the families of what would have been the employee at the farm, whether it's the family members instead of just the employee being evicted from the farm. I'm quite curious to know.
It's the farm worker and the family who's affected by the eviction. So it's not that the one that work on the farm, there's usually a first responder that is the employer, and then the third and second and fourth respondent is those who are staying with the employer on the farm. So it's a interlinking issue because the whole family are affected by the eviction. It's not just the one that worked on the farm.
But by the time, Tenure, that the employee gets evicted, does the employee still work for the farm worker, or at least for the farmer?
Usually the eviction start when there's a dismissal on the farm. So the worker gets dismissed. After dismissal, it's the hearing, and after the hearing, they receive the first notice from the lawyer of the farm workers to say you must leave the house in 1 month. So then the eviction process starts with the whole family. In the case of Ruben Atuanas, who worked for over 20 years on the farm, he was evicted with him. He has 3 children that live with him, and they all been evicted. All their names were in the eviction document. And then Ruben died last year, and then the eldest daughter become the first respondent. So it's a devious cycle that just go on and on. And now Genovia has to stand in court for the eviction.
Sure.
So it's really linked. No one escape of the family.
Nobody's quite spared from it. I do, though, want to play devil's advocate and ask you, why should it be the responsibility of the farmer to provide accommodation even after employee doesn't no longer work for him or her? We'll pick up on that once we do return from the break. Do stay with us. Right, it's the Workers' World Labour Show. I'm Teshidik Trubani. Thank you once again for joining us. We're talking about farm worker evictions and the troublesome that really comes with that particular practice on the farmers, and particularly farming sector, and in that sector where this practice is indeed quite rife. Wendy, I want to understand how far or to what extent the farmer is able to, on a continued basis, being able to provide tenure to largely, for instance, people that do not work for him, and whether if we keep up the practice with accommodation that he would have provided for people that is working for him and the families of those persons that are working for him, why should this be his problem?
You must understand that we've got a particular history when it comes to the farming sector in South Africa. As farms are passed on from generations to generation, the farmer passes it on to his son, to his son, to his son, to his son. The farm workers have worked and lived on farms for generations to generations. I mean, we also look at the history of colonization. We also look at the history of people being deprived of their land. We're looking at the history of indigenous people who own land, who should have land, where people were deprived of it, where the only home farm workers know is the home on the farm. You can't displace people. They've been living on the farm for 6 generations. I'm a former farm worker. I live on a state farm. For 6 generations now, we live on the state farm. My grandfather and my great-grandparents have worked on the state farm that's been owned by the Department of Agriculture. In 96, when we had our constitution, my grandparents were evicted from Elsenburg. My late grandmother was 80 years old. Why were they evicted? Because my grandfather retired after working 46 years for the Department of Agriculture. The community stood up, and I'm still living in the house of my grandfather. And you know why we still live there and we fight for the house? It's because my grandfather earned so little money, even working for the state on the state farm, that he had nothing to show when he retired after 5 decades of working for the Department of Agriculture. And we said that house is his blood, sweat. Now on farms, it's a bit different, but low wages, poverty wages, we come from there. Farm workers got nothing to show. They can't even go from the farm, take a retirement package and go buy them a house. They've got nothing. When the farmer's child is 18, they go live in a flat, there's a town, there's a farm he's going to inherit. The farm workers got nothing of that. And that is the problem that we currently sit with. So as the farm worker works on the farm, the great-great-grandfather, then the great-great-grandfather work on the farm, then the great-grandfather, then the father, the children, the children also used to work on the farm. But we don't say the children want to work on the farm. Sometimes they want to study. Like a young farm worker's daughter in Stellenbosch, she's a medical doctor today. There's farm worker children who study, who become teachers, like in my community, nurses, lawyers. They also want to have career opportunities. But in the cases where farm worker children decide that they do want to continue the legacy of working on the farm, because there's nothing wrong of working on the farm, I feel it's a decent job. Farm workers feed a nation. If they don't feed a nation, we can't even speak food security, because we would starve. We would have nothing to eat. That's the important work that farm workers contribute to this country. So I feel government and farmers actually need to take hands. Some years ago, they had a program for agri-villages where farm workers were put into agri-villages. It's a little village where they put farm workers together. Lots of organizations were against it because they say it was displacing people, were putting people off the land. Now they have services and things there to cover themselves, which they never had before. It's a new life outside of the farm gate. But I believe, you know, the farms are so huge, so many hectares of land, there's so much land. I would rather say, give a portion of the land to the workers as a thank you for their contribution to the wealth of the farm. Let them own that piece of land. And with government subsidy, build new houses for new workers that come, because that workers also going to get old. Their children also going to live there, but they're not going to have the same history with the land that the current farm workers have with the land, because of them staying there for generations and generations.
All right. Tando, I suppose the same question to you, but with a slight different spin on it, is that, okay, I understand that there could be generations of people that have lived on that particular farm, but at which point, when the farmer does employ new people, would there be space, for instance, to allow for new entrants into that market and for them to be provided with accommodation where they work? And of course, I like the idea of this particular village that Wendy talks about, but I want to understand, is this tenure for as long as those people live, and when it particularly links from generation to generation, are those people also protected via ESTA?
So I just want to comment on, very quickly comment on what Wendy's saying. I think when we speak about security of tenure in South Africa, we can't do that devoid of historical context, in that we previously had laws which discriminated against a particular race and against poor people. So when we speak of security of tenure, ESTA seeks to address those and recognize the fact that there's a group of people who have been previously excluded from enjoying certain rights. So the Constitution then seeks to provide a measure of tenure, because with tenure comes human dignity. When you've got security, you start to enjoy the other benefits of the Constitution. So with evictions, ESTA doesn't prohibit evictions. ESTA just says this is how you conduct evictions lawfully. So if a farmer decides that he wants to evict a family, there's a process to do so. Also, we need to consider the role that the state plays in evictions, because the state also has an obligation when a farm owner decides that, okay, he wants to carry out the evictions and he does so lawfully. The state then needs to come in and ensure that if this family cannot afford to find a place to stay for whatever reasons, that they come in as a party and consider the personal circumstances first of all, to see where they can find a place for them, and to actually carry out their mandate and find accommodation for that family, so that no one is rendered homeless. So the reason we go through a court process is the court must satisfy itself that they have considered the personal circumstances, and that they are satisfied that if they grant the eviction order, no one will be left destitute and on the street. We also really just need to highlight government's failures in this regard, that we're having a discussion around farm evictions, but I don't think we are engaging the role that we have people who are elected to have a mandate and to ensure that...
And what role do you think they have to play? Is that the provision of housing, or is that protection of tenure, protection of working conditions, and so on and so on? What role is that for government to play?
Everything you've mentioned is something that the government should oversee. With farm workers, things like probation reports, that they know who is occupying, they know their personal circumstances, consider how many women are in a household, how many people are living with disabilities. As Wendy mentioned earlier, the age of the people in the homes, and to then go out and find alternative accommodation for the people to stay. So earlier I mentioned that we need to balance these two interests, and you were playing devil's advocate before, and you said, for how long must the farm worker accommodate these people? And what the law says is, look, if you decide you want to evict, you can. We recognize your rights as a property, as a landowner, but do not do that at the expense of the people who are currently in occupation.
Yeah. Tenure, just very quickly, before we go to the break, do you believe that government has a role here to step in to further regulate the manner in which evictions do happen and under which conditions those evictions do happen?
Of course, government have to play their role that they're not playing on the moment. If I just refer to how the Department of Rural Development are playing their role, I think they're the most useless department in government. They don't assist. They usually tell us they understaffed. They can't reach people. If we don't send the cases to rural development, they won't know about these evictions. And I also think about during COVID time, there was a moratorium on evictions, but evictions took place during the COVID time. So government doesn't play their role that they're supposed to play. And I think there's not enough if we don't have Wendy's organization, if we don't have the SAU, if we don't have the Rural Legal Center, if we don't have SERI, then most of these cases won't see the daylight. It won't reach the court. Because government are on the side. And it's clear they're on the side of the farm owners. Because they are the ones who are providing food, as they say.
Okay, and I'll pick up on that because legislation at ESTA is particularly what we've been talking about of 1997, but I know that in 2010 there was a bill, the Land Security Tenure Bill, that was considered, including late in 2013, amendment bills to that effect have been spoken about. What role does legislation play in bringing protection to the farm worker is the conversation we'll pick up right after the break. Please stay with us. All right, we are talking about farm worker evictions, the living conditions and the working conditions, what the obligation of the farmer is, and also how to deal with the issue of tenure protection, the land on which they live and have been working for several years. I want to pick up very quickly with Tando from SERI on the issue around, the fact that there aren't and don't appear to be legal protections here to of course the farm worker. You've given us an indication that ESTA gives us a framework under which we can potentially negotiate an exit from the farm and under which conditions those would have to be met. There's clearly loopholes in ESTA, and there were efforts to try and bring some new legislation which, according to my knowledge, have not really gone anywhere. Does ESTA need and require a reform, an amendment of some sort? Do you think the law needs to be tightened in a certain way?
Certainly. ESTA does need to be developed because the law needs to address the lived realities of the people who are living on the farms. So ESTA was brought in by the legislature to give effect to Section 25 rights. And over time, we found that, for instance, as we mentioned earlier, that once an employment relationship ends, the farm owner seems to think that that's it, that's where it ends. So a lot of advocacy work around the rights in ESTA, because a lot of farm owners take advantage of the fact that the farm workers do not know their rights. So a lot can be done to develop ESTA.
And do you believe, Wendy, that legislation is the answer? Because I do suppose it's legislation plus an enforcement mechanism together with a potential change in culture and attitude from farmers.
Yeah, we feel ESTA has been used as ESTA is like a rule book to evict. It's just set out the procedure for farmers to evict farm workers. We know that legislation can be good in a way if it's implemented right. Because if it's not enforced and there's no compliance, then it's just going to be words on paper. If I think prior 94, there were no legislation really covering farm workers. So that's why there was lots of exploitation, low wages, people were evicted left, right, and center. But when there's legislation in place and the legislation works, it means that it's enforced, there's justice for farm workers, then it can be a good thing because it means you won't be evicted without a court order, because that's what the law says. But we often find people being evicted without court orders, and then there's no enforcement. There's no prosecutions for farmers that violate workers' rights in their way. When sheriffs evict people in that inhumane way that they do, when they damage people's property, when all these things are happening, there's no implications for the sheriffs doing that. And I think why evictions are continuing and why workers' rights are violated in this way, it's what Delia was saying earlier, that the government, the issue of farm workers and evictions, it's not really been taken seriously. And that's why there's no capacity at the Department of Rural Development. One ESTA office cover such a huge area, and then there's one ESTA officer at that office that need to assist and get people legal assistance and so forth. And I think that's where our organizations come in. It's to monitor legislation to make sure laws are enforced, because the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform are the custodians of ESTA. And it's to make sure that government work for the people. But I don't want to say that legislation are not good, because sometimes we use legislation for our advantage, and that's where the legal fraternity comes in as well. We saw rights being restored because we went to court. We see things being turned over because there's a court order. But we've also seen court orders that hasn't really worked for the workers.
Yeah.
We must make it work. We must make sure it works for the people.
And Dina, how widespread would you say acts of intimidation are on the part of farmers to try and get families to remove themselves from the property when, so for instance, husband is no longer around? Is there a widespread culture of intimidation and sometimes violence as well as cutting the family off from water and other amenities?
Of course there is, and there's evidence for that. First, they start with cutting out the water, and then there's no electricity, and then your family can't come and visit, and the gates are closed. You have to look for the one who have the remote to open for your family. So these kinds of evictions are real, and it's there. And farm owners are the ones who usually say, but we're good farmers, we look after the farm workers, but I think this is just a cover up for what they are doing when there's no eyes. So like when they say we are the eyes of the farm workers, we are the voice of the farm workers, and farm workers starting to realize that they have rights, and as though the farm owners are protected by Section 25 in our Constitution. We need the same protection as farm workers. Farm workers are not protected, even through ESTA, as Wendy say. It's just a regulation of a regulator for how to evict. It mostly the farm owners and not for farm workers. So these kinds of evictions are there, and it's in the eye, it's open, but still government don't see, they don't act, they don't consider the plight of the farm workers.
Yeah, and I just want to ask Wendy, just to come back to you, that same question, and whether, particularly after the sectoral determination came into play, and there was a minimum wage for farm workers, whether we saw farmers act in a sense of retribution and seeking to either challenge, intimidate, or make life difficult for farm workers.
I mean, when ESTA came into being, there were stories in the news that says workers going to lose their jobs. I mean, we were at that time, I was still a volunteer at the Women on Farms project at the time. We would go out into areas where we know seasonal workers come. We would go into the trains. We would go where we know there's lots of workers, and then we would educate people about the minimum wage and the fact that people will earn that. But we've also seen that there has been some shifts in jobs. Jobs being made redundant from permanent to seasonal. We've also seen job losses during that period. So every time when legislation are passed, then there are job losses. There's always a backlash to legislation. And that's why when these legislations were passed, it's also the time when we saw mass evictions happening from the farm. Because with the legislation come added responsibilities to the farmers, and not all the farmers are happy with these, because prior 94, when there was no legislation, nobody dictated to them what to pay farm workers. There was no rules and things. A farmer told me, like not long ago, this is my farm, I make the rules. If I say a son can't stay here because he's over than 18, then I say so. Doesn't matter if there's a law. This is my farm, and I decide what's happening on my farm. So there are a disregard for laws in legislation. And I think it's because of, the paternalistic relationships we've seen on farms, where it's almost like the father and the children. Farm workers are not even seen for the value that they add to the farm. And I think that some of the things, it's almost like that boss-slave mentality that we've seen under apartheid and even before. And, when I spoke about my grandparents living on the farm for five generations, it's because they were displaced through the Group Areas Act that they ended up on the farm. And there was no place to go back to afterwards, because other people live on the land where they used to live. So, I would say in general, the fight for decent wages when the farm workers had the strike in the Doorns, and also fighting against precarious work and all of that, that's a long fight. We're fighting still for minimum wages. There are still violations of minimum wages and underpayment. I'm not even sure when we're going to get to a decent fight.
Yeah, just very quickly, before I go for a break, Tando, ESTA is different from Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and both of them are enforceable in that same environment. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act and ESTA are two different pieces of legislation, both of which are enforceable in that environment.
Yes.
Okay. That's the point I want to pick up after the break. What are those conditions under which certainly we can hold farmers to account, and what role is there for government to play in greater regulating and keeping a noose, not just on the regulation, ensuring the regulation gets implemented, but more so that the rights of these farm workers are accorded to them, including their family members. Once we return from the break, we'll look at the enforceability of it all. Do stay with us.
We are an online news website that brings you news, analysis, and perspectives from working class, marginalized communities and labor.
Imali esikhiphayo ku-government kungcono kakhulu than ukuhlukunyezwa lokho esikuhlukunyezwa ngamapolisa.
Elicha is published by Workers World Media Productions and is a bilingual website as we cover labor, health, education, and local government issues in English and isiXhosa. To get community, national, and international news from Elicha, please subscribe to our website and download our mobile app.
A dispute, I suppose, depending on it's my farm, it's my work, it's my land, versus the law seeking to bring protection to those that require it the most, because farmers are largely regarded as one of the most vulnerable sectors in our working environment in this country. And then, of course, as Wendy rightfully highlights here, is that there is a historical context that is sensitive to how we understand the conditions under which these farm workers do work, and of course where they live, and those that come with them, their family members, children, wives, etc. I want to understand, Wendy, how particularly vulnerable female farm workers are, because we see a lot of them being seasonal workers, and we see a lot of them having to fend, of course, for the entire family. And when seasonal work so does end, where does it leave the accommodation?
Yeah, 60% of jobs in agriculture is seasonal and temporary. And 2/3 of those jobs are held by women. And we know that seasonal work are very precarious work. I'm a former farm worker. When my first year after I matriculated, I ended up on a fruit farm and I worked as a seasonal worker. Now the season is only maybe 3 months of the year. It depends on the type of fruit and so forth. So I worked at a time when they were doing peaches, apples and pears on a fruit farm in Stellenbosch. It means so you basically have worked for that short season. I had no benefits. I earned 150 Rand per week. I didn't have benefits such as provident funds and all these things, overtime and those kind of things. And I think when seasonal, I was directly employed by the farmer, but then there's seasonal workers that work through labor brokers. And that's where there's more problems. Now UIF registration in most of the cases, I'm not saying all labor brokers don't register workers. There are some that do adhere to legislation, but there are many workers who are not even registered for unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
You know, when you go out in the vineyard, in the orchard, you work, you're exposed to pesticides. You don't even have protective clothing. You're not registered for COIDA. You get injured at work. You go to the Department of Labor, you're not even on the system. So it leaves women with particular problems. You go to the orchards in the vineyards, often you will find there's no toilets there. The toilet in the vineyard, in the orchard, you know, that's your workplace, the occupational health and safety access. Occupational health and safety access, there should be toilets in your workplace. Where do women go when they have a need? We've seen cases of sexual harassment because the women must go find a safe place far from the orchard where she can release herself. And then we see a man following her because he was watching her all the time. Now that put women in safety issues as well. So there's particular issues, and then the low wages. When it rains, you don't work, you don't get paid. We've seen the storms and the flooding that happened the past weeks in Cape Town. So for these periods, people don't work. They don't get paid for the time they don't work. And that's why the jobs are so precarious and so insecure. And you know, seasonal workers often don't belong to trade unions because when you join the union, you're not sure whether you're going to have a job tomorrow. So it leaves women and especially seasonal workers vulnerable to exploitation. They can't organize. They can't exercise their right to associate, to belong to a trade union, for instance. And that's why the employers or the labor brokers exploits that for their advantage. And it leaves the workers vulnerable. Now, because of the weak enforcement by Department of Labor to enforce legislation like sick leave, you go to the doctor or to the clinic, they say, I don't accept a clinic letter. I must get a doctor letter. But the BCA say you can go to a clinic as well. They don't accept that, you don't get paid for sick leave. And these kind of things. So there are real problems for seasonal workers and especially the women that are working on the farmlands.
Yeah, and so that's having a very terrible description of the conditions that farm workers have to work under. In fact, a lot of them are 60% of them are happen to be seasonal work, and a large majority of them happen to be a female. That this is a very precarious situation that we sit with. I want to just quickly understand whether, Tenure, we getting anywhere closer to reforming the landscape, the working conditions of farm workers. Have things gotten any better since that infamous strike that you, of course, had earlier referred to, the farm workers' strike of 2012?
Yeah, look, the low organizing of workers, like Wendy say, work has become permanent work, has become seasonal work. So it's difficult to get people to get unionized, to get organized as a group. Because when there's no organization behind workers, then it's difficult to fight for their rights. It's difficult for them to stand up and fight. We have to do more, because when just in the morning when we call the farm owners to say, look, we have applied for organizational rights, they have many stories why they can't meet us so that we can get organizational rights. So the rights of workers to belong to a union are still undermined, are still farm workers are still refusing to give organizational rights to the unions. So it's not going to get better soon. If we look at the issue of migrant workers, it's also some adding on the issues of farm workers, because most of the workers I see in the morning who get on the truck are migrant workers, and especially migrant worker women who's working on the farm. So this is adding on the problems of farm workers. Also the issue of xenophobia, it's adding on. So we have to see, how do we get where migrant workers also get unionized to make the struggle of farm workers much stronger, and the rights of farm workers rights stronger. Because now there's a division between workers. It doesn't matter from where workers are coming, it's you are still a farm worker, you're still a worker. And we need to get to unionize their two struggles together, because if we don't do that, if we don't work hard enough to get these two together, then we will be stuck with the problems that Wendy have just said beautifully. They have explained what is the struggle of farm workers, if it comes, especially when it comes to women workers in seasonal work. So we have a long way to go before we get unity amongst workers.
Indeed, and I want to wrap up very quickly with you, Tando, in a couple of seconds because we're out of time. How do we bring reform to the sector, meaningful reform? Is it through sectoral determinations? Is it through talking more? Or what is your advice?
I think it's a bit of everything you've mentioned. Increasing advocacy, ensuring that farm women know their rights, knowing where they go when their rights have been violated, providing capacity to organizations that do amazing work for farm workers, also persisting with legal reform. So I think it's a combination of all of those things, yes.
Yeah. And you believe that on the horizon, things, if implemented, can look better?
If implemented, yes, but it's always a matter of implementation. I mean, we've got some of the most progressive laws in this country, but yet people are still being violated. So it boils down to implementation of those laws.
Indeed, and that will be the test of whatever legislation we are talking about, whether it's ESTA, whether it's the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, whether it's the Occupational Health and Safety Act. All of them are really great, but somehow fall short in dealing with the practicalities of what we are sitting with. And that has been our conversation for today. It's a matter that will unfortunately continue to dog the sector, but with people like Wendy and Tenure and of course, organizations like SERI and others, we will get somewhere in trying to bring reform, certainly to this particular sector. Thank you very much for tuning in. Until we chat again, have a lovely day. Bye-bye.